Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel on an extremely hot day here in Perth, Western Australia. It's 41 degrees Celsius. We're making a fan. No, we're not. We're making a wallet. It's a 9-pocket wallet. There's 3 on either side for your credit cards. Sorry, should hold that up. And a side pocket in here and there. And you have your cash section at the back, or your receipt section now, because people don't really use cash so much. It's a very thin wallet. This is Kangaroo Leather, which is naturally thin anyway, but you could use baby calf. I've made the same wallet and had a very similar result from baby calf. I like Kangaroo because it has a high tensile strength, and it seems to mold to your pocket really nicely, and it has that nice leather squeaky squeak noise. Anyway, if you'd like to watch the video, you'll learn how to make this, and there's a link below to the pattern if you would like to get that. Okay, let's go. Print the pattern out and just check that the measurement, there's a 2-inch or a 5.1 centimetre measuring gauge on each of the two, or I think there might be 3 pages. Just make sure that it is really close to 2 inches or just over 5 centimetres. As long as it's very close to that, you'll be fine. Then cut the pattern out roughly. Don't cut right on the line. This is the way I suggest to do it. You may want to cut straight on the line, it's up to you. But I leave a bit of space and then stick the pattern pieces onto the leather. I'm using Kangaroo. It has a finish on it. Usually I don't use finished leather. And I have to be careful with the sticky tape, because when I pull it off, it pulls the finish off as well. You'll probably see some evidence of that, but I'm just picking out the best pieces to use for each of the pieces that I cut out. It would be about 0.8 of a millimetre thick. It's very thin. And I just arrange, depending on how obvious each piece of the pattern is, like the back of the wallet, the very outside of the wallet needs to be a good piece. So scan the hide, make sure you get one without too many blemishes in it, and put that one down first. Now I punch all of the holes before I cut the piece out. And leaving that bit of paper around the edges just makes it so much easier to see the line when you're cutting it. I made a mistake here and started cutting it out before punching the holes. Do as I say, not as I do. Now these holes have been spaced to suit a hole punch, which has the teeth spaced at about 3 millimeters. You'll find that that will fit most of the holes. Here and there I've had to stretch the holes out a little bit just to make sure they get to the corners, or where I want the stitching to start and stop. But in most places you'll be able to just use your 3 millimeter hole punch. 3 millimeter spaced punch. You may want to use just a single hole punch, but the holes would have to be pretty small. I think 1 millimeter holes are probably bordering on too big, but I don't know if you can get anything smaller than a 1 millimeter hole punch. Now I've finished cutting that piece out. I'll go ahead and cut out the rest. You can see there's a mark from where I pulled the sticky tape up. Yes, you can see that. Yes, well, that happens. Now I'm turning the hide over. What I'm going to do, actually, the outside of the pocket, the bit that everybody sees when your wallet is closed, if you're using slanted or diamond shaped teeth on your punch, you'll need all of the holes to slant in the same direction. Now every piece on the wallet except for the very outside piece, face is in the same direction, then the outside piece is turned around and it encloses it all. So you need to cut that outside piece, and I've written it on the pattern. You need to turn it inside up, turn the leather inside up, and then place your pattern on it and cut it out. I'm using a product called Top Coat, which I get from Birdsall Leather in Brisbane in Australia. I don't know if you can get that anywhere else. It has quite a nice shine. The leather does have a finish already, but I'm just putting another one on just because I can. It's not really necessary. This will give it a higher sheen. I did use an edge creaser for the top of each of the inside pockets. It's not necessary. Just burnishing the very edge will be fine. Now I'm skiving, and again, do as I say, not as I do. I'm doing quite a rough, quick job, and the blade wasn't the sharpest. Always have a sharp blade. I'm just thinning the edge of the leather, which is very thin anyway. It didn't really need thinning down, but I do like, when you close the wallet, I like it to look pretty thin. And the simple task of thinning the edges that get stitched together can make quite a lot of difference if your leather's a millimetre thick or more. Now, the product I'm using to burnish the edges of my pieces is called Cmc Powder. I will look up and see what that is the acronym for, but it's something that's used in cake decorating, and it's a food safe product. It's a little bit, like a gum tragacanth that has that sort of viscosity, and it helps to felt down the little fibres on the edge of the leather, which is what you're trying to do to get that nice, slick, smooth, sheeny finish on the edges. And I will quite often do this a couple of times. I'll let it dry in between applications. It's just a product that I happen to have, so that's why I use it. I'm using a piece of toweling, old towel to burnish it with. You can, any kind of cotton or linen fabric will work quite well. On the back of this you can see I haven't skived or thinned one side, the top of the screen. The rest of it has been thinned. The reason for that is that that edge that isn't skived doesn't get stitched down. And that is, let me have a look, that piece is called the Inner Pocket Backing. Now what I should have done, or what I like to do, you don't have to do this, I put little holes at the edge of those two lines. It helps me place the other pockets in the right place, and the other pockets are called the inner pockets. The bottom of each inner pocket will sit on each of those lines. You'll see that later. Now hopefully I'm also going to draw a line between those little holes. I'll put it onto like a polyurethane mat just so that I can push the awl through a bit more and make the holes a little bit more obvious. You won't see them in the finished product, they're going to have layers of leather over the top of them. Now I line up the corners of these inner pockets, and I can see at the top whether it's going to sit straight or not, and then I should get my awl and just scratch a little line across underneath that pocket piece. This helps me when I glue it, it helps me to align it back in the right spot. I'm also going to scarf the finish off so that the glue I put down will stick better. The glue doesn't have any structural assistance in the piece because I'm going to stitch it down, and that's what's going to hold it in place. I just put a little bit of glue on just so that while I'm stitching it, it doesn't move. And this is just a off-the-shelf contact adhesive. It's water-based. I prefer water-based instead of the really smelly other stuff. And I'm just tapping it onto all the bits that will be stitched down. Line it up on that little scratched line, and I'll lift it off again because it's a contact adhesive, the pieces need to be apart. You wait for the glue to dry a bit and then you just put it back down. And yes, that is a very sloppy job, but I will fix it up a bit. It's dried, I'll put it back on, and I'm now just punching the holes right through onto the inner pocket backing. The holes are already on the little inner pocket, and we're going to stitch that, and you'll notice I'm putting the higher of the pockets on first, and I'll work my way down to the bottom of the piece. I won't do a tutorial on saddle stitch. There's a few people who have really good tutorials on there. It is, on the face of it, it's a very simple, methodic thing to do, but it does take practice in order to get the stitches, especially when you're using slanted stitch holes like this. It takes a bit of practice to get all of the stitches looking exactly the same. And the secret is just to be consistent. But I'll show you a bit just so you can see the process, and it is a little bit time consuming. I'll start with a double stitch. I'll just go through the same holes twice to strengthen the start, and I'll do the same at the end. And the stitches don't have to run right to the edge. It's just enough and thick enough and strong enough thread to make sure that your credit cards or whatever cards you put in this pocket won't slip through. I'm using polyester thread. I'm sorry, I can't remember what brand it is, but it's a twisted thread. I've waxed it. I would prefer to use Reza or tiger thread. I do have that, but it's a little bit thick. I think this one is around about 1/2 millimeter thick, and the thinnest tiger thread or Reza thread I have is about 0.6, and it just looks a little bit too chunky. Excuse the neighbours, they're just driving their rackety old ute down the laneway. Now I've finished and I've done my double stitch at the end. Because it's polyester thread, I can melt it, and it's a great way of ending your stitches if you're very careful. You melt the thread and then pat it flat, probably with something other than your finger because it does burn a bit. But you pat it flat and it just cannot slip back through the hole. Now, where are we? I've stitched the two of the inner pockets, and I'm just going to punch the holes on the ends of the tabs, and I'm lining them up, and I like to do this now because I like to pull the very end of the top of each pocket. I don't want the hole to half puncture the very top of the pocket. So I'm pulling it out of the way, just curling up the very tip of each pocket, and then planting the punch hole, the tines down, or the teeth. Because I don't want to compromise the strength on the top of each of the pockets. It's a bit fiddly, but you know, you'll get there. And as long as there's a bit of a hole for the needle to go through, it'll work fine. Now I just need to make sure that when I stitch these two sets of pockets down, I put them the right way so that the unskived edges face inwards and are next to each other, because they become a pocket as well. So I'm just going to stitch those very edges first before I stitch the whole thing onto the wallet, onto the back pocket where the cash goes. Now they're stitched, and I'm just going to trim up the edges so it's flush. I'm doing this very slowly, and I'm going to line it up with the stitches so that the edge of the pocket is parallel to the stitches. And I'm going through it just a little bit at a time. If I push too hard, I tend to wriggle the ruler and make a mess of things. So I would rather do it in up to half a dozen cut runs instead of just the one cut and push too hard and go crooked. And there was just another little bit that wouldn't come off, so I'm going back to trim that. And another little bit that just wouldn't let go. Going through several layers, this can happen. Having a sharper X-Acto knife would help. I haven't used any fancy tools other than the edge creaser, but that was quite cheap. You can buy them online quite cheaply. There's no need for fancy tools if you're doing basic work like this. But as I said, sharp blades and knives ease the workload, and you are less likely to cut yourself with something very sharp because you're not pressing as hard and not straining. Onto the back of the wallet, and this piece is the inner side of the note pocket. So this is the one that will stitch all of those inner pockets to. Make sure you've got your skived edges in the right place, and you've got the bits that you've stitched already facing each other. And I'm just making little marks with my awl, measuring out where I should start the glue. by holding the other pockets up the top. I can measure that's how far in I have to go. Again, I'm just putting a little bit of glue on just to make sure that the pieces stay in the same place when I stitch. Now, I should have done this in shot, but all I'm doing is gluing the little pocket sets. Now, I am only gluing along the top of the inner side of the note pocket. I'm gluing that piece to the top of the little set of pockets that I've stitched together. Now the glue's dry or dry enough. When to contact adhesive, the water-based varieties, the ones that I've used, as soon as the glue is mostly transparent, it's generally right to just put the two sides together. Just make sure you choose a glue that remains flexible and it dries clear. I'm using a sewing pin just to help line up the first hole, and then I'll put another pin in on the last hole because I already have the holes punched in these pieces. And it just makes stitching easier if your holes align. Now I have stitched the top of this piece. I'm sanding it now. Where you pull the stitches in tight, you'll feel if you run your finger along, it just creates a little bit of a bump on the edge of the leather. I'm just sanding it down flat. It is good to sand in the one direction, and I'm using a fairly fine grit sandpaper. Now I'm just going to burnish the edge with my CMC powder, which I think I use around about a quarter of a teaspoon with about a quarter of a cup of water. And that dries clear as well. While it's wet, you can see the dark line it creates, but it will just, as it dries out, it disappears and just leaves the edges with a nice sheen and a very smooth finish. It's starting to look like a wallet. Now the back piece, which goes on backwards, which is why we cut it out the leather upside down. top. And now we just need to stitch the sides and the bottom. I don't stitch right across the bottom. You can do if that's what you want to do, but I stop in the middle. There's about a 2 centimeter gap in the middle, just where I don't stitch. Now as you fold it, you can see that the outside piece, when you look at the pattern, the outside pocket, let me see what they're called. The outer layer of the note pocket and the inner side of the note pocket, they're different lengths, but when you fold it, they end up matching. And that's the bit I don't stitch. Gluing again. It was another hot day. The glue was drying really quickly. Just checking that I don't glue any further than the stitch holes. The stitch holes are easier to see on the smooth side. And when I'm stitching down the sides, I also do a double stitch at the top of each new pocket, just to reinforce the edge, because with putting cards in and out of those pockets, it does create a bit of strain. So I do a double stitch to start with, and then when I get to that first pocket, I'll stitch over it a couple of times. And you can see that the edges don't quite all meet up really neatly. That's okay. There's a little bit of room for error, so if you find when you're stitching it they don't all meet exactly, we'll be able to trim that like we did trim the inner pockets. I'm at the top of the first pocket. And I'll go twice to create a stronger grip on the edge. I make sure each time I go through that I don't stab the thread. Now one side's done. I'll need to trim those edges a bit, but I'll wait until the whole thing is stitched. Now when I put the glue on these two sides, I'll make sure it's in the folded position so that the glue I put on the outer piece lands in the right spot. So I'll fold it and then put the two glued sides together. I find with water-based adhesive contact adhesive, I can pull it apart a couple of times if I don't get it quite in the right spot the first time, which is what happened there. And now that's all stitched together. I just need to trim those edges. I should be using my clear ruler so I can see that I'm lining up this trim with the stitches, but it went walkabout. I don't know where it is, so I'm having a good guess here. Now I'll sand the edges again, trying to go in the one direction all the time. Well, most of the time. And the bottom corners, I'm going to round them off ever so slightly. I find if I just leave them square, they tend to buckle more, and if I round it off just a little bit, they don't seem to buckle as much. It doesn't take much. I'm just taking, as you can see, maybe a millimetre, 2 millimetres at the most. It doesn't matter so much at the top. You can do, I'm going to just put a slight angle on it, making sure I don't cut the stitches. And the stitches are only 3 millimetres in from the edge, so these are tiny cuts. I'm also using the grid on my cutting mat to help me get a right angle. It just seems easier to see if I've got lines to follow. Just a little bit more of a sand, then I'll put the CMC gel on, burnish it, and it's done. This has just been a quick video, just to help you maybe get through 1 or 2 spots that you don't quite understand what you should do. I'm sure with every 10 wallets made, there'll be 10 slightly different versions. Thank you for watching. You can download the pattern by clicking on the link below. And my next project will be a tote bag. Hopefully I'll have that up in the next month or 2. So bye for now.